All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to week number two for PPA 500. Hope everyone is doing well and having a good week so far. First off, thank you very much for Canvas essay number one and those submissions. I've gone through and read through those and provided a little feedback. All of the Canvas essay number one submissions were very well done, exactly what I'm looking for. And so just continue to do that on your future Canvas essays, and you will be in good shape. Thank you also for the initial skill self-assessments. I think those were all done well, and those have been graded, returned to you. Please remember to hold on to an electronic copy of that initial skill self-assessment because that is something that you will need to put in to part one of your student learning portfolio once you get to the end of the program. And so again, you're not turning that portfolio in until fall of 2027, but just make sure you have the electronic copy so you don't have to go back and try and recreate it whenever it comes time to turn in the portfolio. Then, in terms of assignments for next week, you have Canvas essay number two. Canvas essay number two draws upon some of the information that we will cover in class tonight on accountability and ethics, and specifically ask that you draw upon the ASPA Code of Conduct and highlight three out of the eight principles in the ASPA Code of Conduct that you think would be especially difficult either for you to implement or for your organization to implement, and why those principles may be difficult. Now, those eight principles in the ASPA Code of Ethics we will cover in class tonight. But before we get to our discussion of accountability and ethics, I know last week we didn't have time to do those breakout rooms, and so I promised that at the beginning of class tonight, we would do the breakout rooms. So we'll do that to begin class tonight. What I will do is we have about 20 people here so far. So I think what I'll do is I'll probably create three different breakout rooms, and I'll randomly assign you to one of those three breakout rooms. And then the job of each one of those rooms is to answer the question I have up on the screen. How does our system of checks and balances and federalism affect the work of public administrators? We spent a lot of our time last week, really all of our time for the most part, talking about American government, the institutions of American government, limitation of power and separation of powers, and our vertical limitation of power through our system of federalism. And then we kind of wrapped up our discussion with that so what question. So we spent all this time talking about American government. Well, so what? We're in an MPA program. How does that affect the work we do as public administrators? And so what I'd like to do with these breakout rooms is afford you the opportunity to answer this question of how does system of checks and balances and federalism, how do they affect the work of public administrators? And I would like for each of our rooms to do a couple of things. After discussing that question as a group, I would ask that your room come up with at least a couple of examples of how separation of powers and federalism affect the work of public administrators. And then number two, make sure that each room selects a spokesperson. Because what we will do is we'll work in these breakout rooms for probably about 30 or 40 minutes dealing with this question. Then I will have us reconvene as a class. And then when we reconvene in the main room, I will then have the spokesperson for each of our three rooms then share out what your rooms came up with. So that's kind of the practice we're going to use with these breakout rooms. Again, I try and incorporate them as frequently as possible so you can all get more familiar working with each other since you're going to be working with each other for the next almost 2 years as a cohort. It's good to start early. So we'll start out with these breakout rooms. After we complete the breakout room exercise, then we'll move into a discussion of accountability and ethics, and I'll walk you through what makes ethical adherence so much more difficult and so much different in the public service as compared to the private sector. Take you through the ASPA Code of Conduct. We'll talk about different types of accountability, handle all that information. That'll probably take us about an hour or so to do that. Then once we're done talking about accountability and ethics, I'll make a couple of quick mentions to doing research in public administration. And I think I told you last week, for this module on our Canvas site, I have a video of Kelly Janikowski, who is our uh, disciplined librarian, I guess you would call her. And Janicek, I'm sorry, called her by the wrong name, Kelly Janicek. And Kelly Janicek is our disciplinary librarian. And she comes in to some of our on-campus PPA 500 courses and gives about an hour synopsis or overview, if you will, of how you do public administration research. And so we've recorded that and I've provided that recording. It's about an hour long recording for you on our Canvas site. And so I'm going to ask that you do watch that video between now and next week. And then before we break tonight, what I'll do is talk to you a little bit about things such as peer-reviewed journals and how in this program, whenever you're doing research in future courses, your research will most likely be coming from peer-reviewed journals. And so we'll talk about how you obtain those peer-reviewed journals, what peer-reviewed journals are, and some of the differences between the peer-reviewed journals that are considered to be high quality journals in the discipline versus the others. And so I'll make a quick mention of that for a few minutes at the end of class tonight. Then we'll get out a little bit early tonight so that you'll have the time to watch that video. Since it's an hour video, I figure it's better that you watch it on your own rather than us sitting here together and watching it in class. And so I'll break a little bit early tonight to afford you the time to watch that video by Kelly Janicek. If she knew I said the wrong name, she would probably kill me because we've known each other for about 25 years, but it's Kelly Janicek. Okay, let me go ahead and set up some breakout rooms. So we have everyone here tonight. So I think it usually works well. Three breakout rooms will have 7 to 8 people in each breakout room. So let me create 3 rooms. And what I'm doing is just allowing Zoom to go ahead and randomly assign everyone into one of those 3 rooms. So I've created the rooms. So room number 1 has 8 people in it. Room number 2 has 7. Room number 3 also then has 7. Once I open the rooms, if you haven't done breakout rooms before, once I open the rooms, you'll then be prompted to go into one of those 3 rooms. And then you'll work in those rooms. I will then drop in and give you some time warnings. And so when we have 5 minutes left, I'll drop in and tell all the rooms 5 minutes remaining. Then I'll give you a 2 minute warning. And then whenever I close the rooms down, you then have a minute to leave the room and come back into the main room. And then that's where we will share our results from our groups. So again, for each group, answer that question that I have on the screen for you, provide at least a couple of examples of how separation of powers and federalism affect the work of public administrators, speaking from your own personal experience, if you have personal experience working in the public or nonprofit sector. So the spokesperson will give me a couple of examples that the group came up with. Do make sure to select a spokesperson so that we know who will be sharing out the results from the group. Okay? Make sense? All right, let me go ahead. I'll open up. I'm sorry, April, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Okay, so um, you're saying how it affects our work in public administration versus non. I'm sorry, I didn't catch it. You were a little fast.
Yeah, it's just the question is just asking how does separation of powers and federalism affect what you do as a public administrator? And so we're not really comparing public and private sector at this point. Just for the work that you're doing, how are you affected by separation of powers and or federalism? Does that make sense? And just a couple of examples that the group can come
Yes.
up with would be great. Okay,
Thank.
perfect. Absolutely. Okay, it's about 6:10, so I'm going to open up the rooms and they can go into your assigned room. And like I said, we'll work on this for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll come back in the main room and see what everyone came up with. So the rooms are now open. So you've been invited into your room and feel free to go into your room. Okay. Looks like all the rooms are closed and looks like we're all back in the main room. So let's go ahead and see what each room came up with. And so we'll start with room number one. I think room number one was Alex, Alexandra, Alexis, Ashley, Lorraine, Robert. Um, Whomever the spokesperson is, I'll turn the floor over to you.
That is me. Hi, everyone. I'm Lorraine, and I was with Group One. And some of the things we talked about were first that checks and balances affect our daily work, requiring administrators to follow rules, regulations, and instead of just acting alone and not having those checks and balances, which creates transparency when you have checks and balances. And federalism affects us because we're also coordinating between different levels of government. Um, and so some of the examples that we came up with were one was for federal funding for housing. So verifying income, eligibility, inspections, assets, and among a lot of other information that has to be done before this funding can be applied. But there's challenges with that as well. Delays in processes, hard to get information sometimes, or responses from federal agencies. And then some felt that some of these checks and balances can be outdated. Some of the processes are outdated sometimes, and so they do delay processes. But again, we are understanding that these things are in place because they are those checks and balances. Another example was for family center programs as part of a branch of the city, but where they also are working with school districts and other local government and regional government. And so sometimes the process can be conflicting among those partners when we're doing those checks and balances, just for the processes and rules to instill safety. While one agency might do one thing one way, one might be doing it another way. So sometimes that makes it a little difficult and challenging to make sure we're doing those checks and balances. But it adds complexity, limits unilateral action. It does slow down the process, but stabilizes decisions and creates accountability.
Great job, Lorraine. And thank you, room number one. And those are great examples. And I agree, there is some certainly redundancy that we get with separation of powers as well as with federalism. And the fragmentation we get from a federal system can be good and bad. And as you point out, one of the bad aspects is it can be conflictual in that when you have different governments taking different approaches, whether it be the state level or the local level, it can really be confusing for citizens, and one approach may conflict with another approach. The good thing about a federal system is that when you have state and local governments that are empowered with the ability to make decisions, then the decisions they make, at least ostensibly, may better reflect the desires of the citizens who live within those jurisdictions. More so than what we might get from a more unitary form of government if we had just a national government. So that is good in that those state and local governments can express the desires of their citizens. The problem with that, though, is that not every citizen has the same amount of resources to be able to what the mobile consumer thesis would say, the ability to vote with their feet. So if you assume that every city provides its own bundles of goods and services, that citizens could then select the bundle of goods and services that they prefer and decide to live in that city. Well, the problem is that the citizens who have the ability to vote with their feet and to move to those cities where the bundle of services more closely approximates what they want, they have the resources. They're oftentimes the ones that are shouldering more of a burden in terms of tax revenue. So as those more affluent residents move out, you have a hollowing out of these cities. And that's something that we saw in the 1970s and the 1980s with the population migration patterns out of Rust Belt cities down to the Southwest and to the Sun Belt. And so once you have these more affluent residents moving out, then you lose tax base. And when you lose tax base, then the city has less revenue to then meet the increasing needs of the citizens who are left within that city. And so there are good and bad aspects of the fragmentation that comes out of a federal system. I think, as you pointed out, Lorraine, as your group pointed out, we need to be cognizant of those positive and those negative types of impacts. So very well done. Thank you, Lorraine. We'll move on to room number two. I think that's Marina, Adriana, Martin.
Hi everyone, I'm Adriana. I'm the spokesperson for number two. Similarly to what Lorraine shared as far as the impacts of checks and balances, we had a lot of the same conversations. The two examples that we talked about a little bit more in detail was in regards to funding regulations and the fragmentation between federal and state guidelines, the changes in requirements for us to access the resources for us to do the work that we need to do in securing that funding. One recent example is the Big Beautiful Bill and how that has impacted a lot of the sources of revenue that are tied to the operations. And uh, it has definitely slowed down the work that we do as far as like these things still have to happen, still students still have to attend school, these grants, we still need the funding from the grants, but just finding ways to work around some of the regulations that are implemented and that are usually tied to us being able to have the funding secured. And then the second example that we talked about was in regards to compliance. And we talked a little bit about ADA compliance in regards to work in public administration as far as communication systems like websites. Buildings also have to be compliant and the rules that we have to abide by. This does slow down the process in doing the right thing by the citizens that we do serve. But it is ultimately the right thing to do, and it allows for the work that we're doing for it to be accessible to everybody, regardless of abilities. So those were the two examples that we talked about.
Great. Thank you, Adriana. Those are two great examples. The ADA example is a great example that obviously the ADA, when it was passed back in 1990, it did impose some burdens on state and local governments financially in terms of their capital improvement projects and the way in which they had to do these capital improvement projects. I worked on a study with the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations back in the mid 90s, and our piece of the study was actually on ADA. It was on the impacts of the ADA on local school districts. And not to digress too much, but one of the things that we found in our study is that local school districts didn't realize that they had flexibility built into the ADA. And so some of the flexibility built into the original legislation allowed local school districts to incorporate all of these facility changes within their capital improvement plan. And so they didn't have to do all these changes in year one. They just had to plan for these changes throughout their 5-year capital improvement plan. And it was interesting to see that a lot of local school districts didn't realize that. And so they just thought they had to make all these changes all in year one, which would then be cost prohibitive for them. And so there is sometimes some confusion whenever you have those federal guidelines and hand it down to state and local governments. I think the other example in terms of federal funding, I think that's a great example. Whenever money comes down from the federal government, it usually comes down with strings attached. Because when the federal government provides money to state and local governments, it's doing so for a reason. And that reason is to get state and local governments to come in compliance with achieving national objectives. I've done a lot of work in education finance. I served on a local school board for several years. And I've seen that with federal funding that when Title One, Two, Three, and Four funding comes through from the federal government, there are very specific strings that are attached to how that money must be spent. And there's very little flexibility in terms of moving those pots of money around. You can move some money from Title IV to Title II for certain types of teacher training programs, but for the most part, it has to be spent where it hits. And then also when you're getting state money as a local school district, you oftentimes have to wait before you can spend that money until the state legislature gets around to passing what they call their trailer bills. And when you take your budgeting course, you'll talk about the state budgeting process, and you'll see just how important those trailer bills are. That even when the state legislature passes a budget on June 15th and it's signed by the governor by June 30th, and the new fiscal year begins on July 1st, local governments oftentimes have to wait to spend that money until the state legislature tells them how that money can be spent, because all those specifics are not included in that budget bill. And so throughout July and into August, the state legislature then passes these additional, what they call trailer bills, that will then provide the specific details for how that money should be spent. And so even a state money coming down to the local government, there are strings attached and there are limitations on how that money should be spent. And so that is clearly an impact upon what we can do as public administrators and what we can spend our money on here at the local level. Very well done. Thank you very much, Adriana. Thank you very much, room number two. And we have finally room number three, last but certainly not least.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Brendan. I'm speaking for room three. One thing that I think we had some great examples, but one thing we kind of, I think that we realize is our role as public administrators is anticipating what the federal government and state governments are going to do. And then as we anticipate communicating how we're going to implement these things to our stakeholders or to our community. And I think that's one of our greatest challenges. And one example was something I'm personally experiencing right now with I work in a school district, a food service program with the new dietary guidelines for Americans that just came out. And that is a huge guide to what we serve in school meal programs and the National School Lunch Program and this new whole milk in schools thing now as well. You know, the community is asking, "Oh, where's the whole milk?" And it's not quite ready yet. It's not that we don't have guidance on how we're supposed to implement that in schools yet. We just know it's happening. And so these things are out in the press, and then it's a huge challenge for us to try to figure out how we're going to implement these things and when to start implementing these things. And then it goes to the state. The state can sometimes make their own changes before it gets down into schools. So there's a lot of layers of government before it even gets to us. And then another example, different laws that are passed, AB 339, which is to give unions 45-day notice when contracting work out. Again, it's something that just extends your timeline. As a public administrator, you have your projects you've always done, and you always know you have this much time to do your bids and get things ready. But now you have this extra bit of notice that you have to give to not just the union, but then taking it to your city council to get their approval for it. And then one thing we could both kind of commiserate on with that is working with city councils and school boards is sometimes they can be politically polarized and they may not agree with the state or federal guidance that has come out. And you're trying to follow the letter of the law and make things happen and follow the law and provide those services. But then it gets held up at your city council or your school board where you kind of have to get in more depth and really sell it to them, even though it's the law. So it's interesting how we could all relate with different things and the different things we have to do as public administrators to be this kind of middleman to the state and federal government, all the way down to the communities and the public that we serve.
Great. Those are excellent examples. Thank you, Brendan. And I really like that point about having to be anticipatory, having to anticipate what's coming out of the federal government. And then citizens oftentimes do not distinguish between different levels of government. We're all painfully aware of that. For a lot of citizens, government is government is government. And so when we are being required to do something at the local level, it's sometimes difficult for us to explain to our citizens, well, this is the law, as Brendan says. This is state law or this is federal law, and this is what we have to try and adhere to. I was on that school board during COVID. And that's something we struggled with in terms of masking requirements and virtual learning requirements. And we had a lot of people showing up to our meetings decrying the use of masks in school or decrying the use of virtual learning. And we would try and tell them this is not necessarily our decision. We're a special purpose government. As a special purpose government, we have to be held accountable to the state. We're held accountable to the county Office of Education. We're held accountable to the mandates coming out of the county Department Department of Public Health. And so we're adhering to the law. And sometimes that's very difficult to communicate to your citizens. And so I agree with you, Brendan. I've actually I've lived through that myself on the school board. So those are absolutely great examples. Thank you, all three rooms. I think that you did a really nice job of not only from the 30,000 foot level talking about the impacts, but actually drilling down to some really good contemporary and practical examples of how American government actually does have an impact upon what we do as public administrators. So very well done. Thank you, everyone. And again, we'll try and do these breakout rooms as often as we can in class sessions, depending upon how heavy of a lift we have in a certain evening covering information. If time remains, we have the ability, we're going to try and do as many of these breakout room exercises as possible. But let's move into our second main topic for the course, which is accountability and ethics. And so we are all part of a Masters of Public Administration program, and the vast majority of us work in the public sector. So we know that public service is difficult than working in the private sector. We know in public service, we are held far more accountable for our actions than perhaps we would be if we were working in a private corporation. And we know that's the case because of the types of resources that we manage. We manage public taxpayer money. We manage other public resources such as facilities. We manage human beings, and so we manage other public administrators. Sometimes we have a fiduciary responsibility whereby we are managing pension funds. And so it's not really the money of that level of government, but rather you're managing it. You're in that fiduciary type of capacity, which means it's imperative that we hold public administrators accountable for their actions. Accountability looks at a relationship between, at the very general level, people and things. So for our purposes, we're talking about the relationship between public administrators and the resources that they are charged with managing. This relationship is something that is difficult for voters to hold administrators accountable for. Because as we all know, as administrators, we get our positions based upon our KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities. So we are merit-based employees. We are not elected into our positions like elected officials are. And so there's not really that direct link between an administrator and the voters. The conduit, that linkage, that connective tissue is obviously going to be the policymakers, the elected officials. So that's why we have this oversight where it's up to elected officials, up to policymakers to try and hold administrators accountable in lieu of the voters being able to hold them directly accountable. So we really rely upon these policymakers and these elected officials to help achieve accountability in the public sector. The problem is a lot of elected officials don't want to engage in their oversight responsibilities because whenever you're an elected official, one of your primary goals, I think, Brendan kind of pointed it out, if you're on a school board or a city council, one of the primary goals of an elected official is oftentimes to get reelected. There's a very famous book written way back in the early 1970s, I think it was 1974, by a political scientist named David Mayhew. And what Mayhew wanted to do is he wanted to understand the motivations of members of Congress. And he wrote his book called Congress, the Electoral Connection, which kind of gives away his thesis. And his thesis is the primary motivation of members of Congress is to get reelected. And again, not to digress too much here, but Mayhew makes the argument that in order to get reelected, members of Congress tend to engage in three different types of activities. One thing that they will do is they will advertise. And so they'll get their name out there to try and build name recognition and name recall because that helps them get reelected. A second thing that they will do is they will take positions on issues, but they will take very high profile positions on very low risk issues. So what Mayhew referred to as a process known as minimax. So elected officials will try and minimize their risks while maximizing their electoral benefits. So, these very non-controversial issues of, standing up for, the American way of life and, apple pie and all those very staple American issues, they'll take very high profile positions on, but they'll shy away from taking a high profile position on a controversial issue because that can hurt them in the reelection prospects. But the third thing that they do is credit claiming. And in credit claiming, they will claim credit for some very popular types of programs. And so that's why you see members of Congress try and put their names on recreation centers and their names on parks and their names on bridges and roads. That's claiming credit for accomplishing something while in office. And that's probably the most powerful tool that they have to get reelected. So if you're an elected official and your primary goal is to get reelected, accountability and holding administrators accountable can be kind of a dicey type of activity because once you start to hold people accountable and you start looking into their accountability, that's naturally going to lead to uncovering problems. And so if there are problems that are uncovered, if you're attached and associated with those problems, even though you didn't cause them, you're associated with them, that can hurt your reelection prospects. So there's a natural tendency on the part of policymakers to kind of keep their distance when it comes to holding members of the bureaucracy accountable for their actions. Whenever you have elected officials who are not willing or cannot serve as that connective tissue between the administrators and the voters, that's when you tend to have difficulties with accountability. Now, when the system is working the way in which it is supposed to work, we have oversight from elected officials over the actions of administrators. So we as administrators, as we are all very well aware, we are held to account for the things that we are doing and the things our agencies are doing through this legislative oversight process. So if you're a federal agency, you're a federal administrator, you could very well be called before Congress to testify in terms of what you are doing, how you're doing it, and why your agency may not be accomplishing the goals that it's supposed to accomplish. That is congressional oversight. Oversight can be very difficult for a couple of reasons. One reason why oversight is difficult is because of this phenomenon known as the principal-agent relationship. And you may have run into this principal-agent relationship before, but the principal-agent relationship postulates that the overseer, the member of Congress or the member of the state legislature, they are the principals in the relationship, and then the agency and the administrators are the agents. If the principal oversees the actions of the agents, you would assume that the principal would have more information than the agent. We know in the principal-agent relationship that is simply not true. There are a lot of information asymmetries whereby the agency has the information and has more information than the principal. Who knows best what is going on a daily basis in that organization than the people in that organization implementing those programs on a daily basis? So whenever you have this information asymmetry where the agent has more information than the principal, that introduces a lot of problems into this relationship. And one of the primary problems that's introduced is what's known as the problem of a moral hazard. So it places a moral hazard on these administrators in that administrators have the information. Those administrators then need to decide how much information and what information to then provide to the principals. It's a moral hazard because there is a disincentive for providing that information, because obviously the more information you provide to the principal, the more information the principal then has to hold you accountable for your actions. So there's a clear disincentive for being as forthcoming as possible with this information, this moral hazard that administrators then face. Now, as we'll see when we talk about the ASPA Code of Ethics, there's one principle that requires full disclosure, that requires that we fully inform and advise those who are tasked with overseeing what we are doing in our agencies. So ethically, we're supposed to provide that information, even though there's a disincentive for doing so. So sometimes this principal agent relationship doesn't work the way in which it's supposed to work on paper. So that's one problem. A second problem is executive privilege. And we have seen this more and more frequently at the national level, where Congress will call in a member of the administration to testify about what they are doing and how they are doing it. And that member of the administration will decline to answer the questions because of executive privilege. So the president will assert executive privilege, saying that these are privileged conversations that I, as the president, have had with members of my administration, and so therefore they're constitutionally protected, and this member of my administration doesn't have to share this information with Congress. The more the expressions of executive privilege, the less information Congress is able to get to conduct its oversight responsibilities. So all this is just meant to say that oversight is difficult, and this is one of the primary difficulties in holding people accountable for their actions within governments at all three levels. Accountability is important because we need to kind of try and strike this balance between making sure people are doing things ethically and controlling their behaviors, while at the same time freeing them up and giving them enough flexibility to make sure they're doing their jobs well. That is this very precarious balance that we have to try and meet within this idea of trying to promote accountability. Too many accountability mechanisms, too many control mechanisms can certainly inhibit bold action because it could make it very, it could make administrators overly careful, that they are concerned about running afoul of some arcane or very little known type of administrative regulation. And so they're going to be very conservative in terms of what they do. And they won't, I hate the term think outside the box, but they won't be creative and they won't have a lot of latitude to make these very creative and innovative types of decisions. It also, when we have a lot of administrative controls, it also makes it difficult for us to attract the best and brightest into the public service. And we'll talk more about that problem in a couple of seconds. But let's really drill down on this idea of accountability and how we in public administration measure and define this idea of accountability. How do we know, at the very basic level, how do we know what is ethical behavior versus what is considered to not be ethical behavior? Well, there are different approaches that the discipline has taken to defining what is ethical and what is not ethical over the years. The first approach that public administration has taken to accountability is what's known as the legal boundaries approach. The legal boundaries approach is very much rooted in Woodrow Wilson and his politics administration dichotomy. Now, in a couple of weeks, we will read Woodrow Wilson and his study of administration. Woodrow Wilson's study of administration really is the beginning point for a discipline of public administration. You've probably read it before if you had any undergraduate public administration courses, but essentially what Woodrow Wilson is saying is that the work of government writ large is so complex that we need a separate study of administration. Essentially, what he says is if we can strip politics out of administration and study administration outside of the realm of politics, we will then be able to come up with the most effective way of doing what he called the quote unquote business of government. So if we can focus only on administration, then we can learn how to most effectively do the business of government. So he creates this politics administration dichotomy. On the political side, you have the policy making. So on the political side, you have elected officials, the policymakers, who are formulating these public policies. Then on the administrative side, you have administrators who are then charged with implementing those policies. So political side, elected officials, administrative side, you have administrators. A politics administration dichotomy. Now, this was done, proposed by Woodrow Wilson back in 1887, so the late 1800s. And the upshot of this is in the legal boundaries approach, we have created this boundary between the political side and the administrative side of the house. So if an administrator is quote unquote playing politics, so if an administrator is getting involved in political types of activities on the policy formulation side, that could be considered to be unethical behavior, that they need to stay within their lane in terms of implementing these policies. Conversely, if you have elected officials who leave the political side and get involved in the daily administration of these programs, that would also be considered to be unethical and unwarranted. So essentially, policymakers stay in their lane and administrators stay in their lane. It's a very clear demarcation between politics and administration. However, we came to realize very quickly in public administration that that line of demarcation is not that clear. And as early as the 1930s, you have public administration theorists such as John Gauss, who were questioning this politics administration dichotomy, saying that you can't really divide the two because there are situations where administrators contribute to the policy formulation process. Administrators contribute to policy formulation by advising the policymakers, lending their expertise to how these policies should be formulated, and that's not unethical. In fact, that is something that is wholly warranted because that provides the information that those policymakers need in order to formulate effective policies. And so we have very much, as John Gauss says, this blurring of the lines between the political world and the administrative world. And so therefore you can't just say, well, policymakers do this and administrators do this. Anything outside those lanes will be unethical. So it really does muddy the waters a bit. It makes it more difficult. And this is what I think Kettle refers to as the political challenges approach to accountability. In that because of the bleeding over between politics and administration, we cannot just in that crystal clear manner say administrators do this and politicians do this. Then fast forward in through the 1900s, as we have FDR administration, we have the New Deal, we have all of these different alphabet agencies and programs that are being developed that we had talked about last week in our evolution of federalism. We realize that the legal boundaries and the political challenges approaches are kind of antiquated, and they're no longer as relevant as they used to be. And the reason for that is that each organization, all these agencies that are being created, kind of develop their own organization cultures. And one organization's culture will look a lot different than another organization's culture. Culture is essentially a set of shared norms, values, and expectations. That's what a culture is. So if different organizations have different sets of expectations and norms and values, can we have one set of rules that we can apply to every single organization equally? And the answer with this evolving policy problems approach to accountability is no, that we need to take into account the individual culture within the organization and take a much more contextual approach to holding people accountable. It's no longer, well, they're a politician or they're administrator. Either they're on the policy formulation side or they're on the implementation side. It's now a much more complex and convoluted process because we have to take organization culture and context into account. The result of that is that it has become much more difficult for us to effectively hold people accountable for their actions. I know that we have seen in recent years a lot of reports of unethical behaviors, and it seems like every day we see more and more media reports of unethical behaviors at all three levels of government. And that's because accountability is difficult. We'll talk more about how we get that balance and how we can actually implement accountability in just a second. But there are different elements of accountability that we can focus on. So far in our discussion, we've been talking about accountability kind of as this monolithic term, holding people accountable for their actions. But we have to recognize that when we hold people accountable, we are holding them accountable for different types of things. The most common type of accountability is fiscal accountability. So in fiscal accountability, we are concerned with whether agency officials are spending money on the programs that they are charged with managing and only on those programs. So in fiscal accountability, we're essentially asking the question, is the money, are public funds being spent in the way in which they are legally appropriated and legally mandated to be spent? As we know from our reading of the Constitution last week, there is an appropriations clause in the Constitution whereby Congress must first appropriate money before removing it from the federal treasury. And we said last week, appropriation is just basically the process of saying how money needs to be spent and how it should be spent legally. So in fiscal accountability, we're making sure that that money is being spent in the legally mandated way in which it's supposed to be spent. Typically, when we see a lot of these ethical violations, most of them will get back to the issue of fiscal accountability. Either people are misspending money, spending money in areas that's not appropriate to be spent, or they are spending money for private gain as opposed to the public interest. When we talk about civil service reform in a couple of weeks, I'll read you an excerpt from a book called Plunkett of Tammany Hall. And Plunkett of Tammany Hall was basically the memoir of a person named George Washington Plunkett. And George Washington Plunkett worked in the big political machine in New York of Tammany Hall. And if you're familiar with those political machines in our large cities, those political machines basically controlled every single aspect of life in those cities. So who got contracts, who got jobs, all of that was controlled by these political machines. And Tammany Hall was by far the most famous political machine, and it was in New York. George Washington Plunkett, who worked in Tammany Hall, wrote his memoirs, Plunkett of Tammany Hall, and most of the examples he provides in his memoirs are examples of him doing things to benefit his own private interests, using public resources, using public information to benefit him privately. There's one really interesting line in there where he refers to graft. And, the word graft we usually associate with corruption today. We kind of use them synonymously. But he says there are two different types of graft or corruption. There's honest graft, and then there's dishonest graft. Now, that sounds weird to us today because when we talk about graft and corruption, we naturally think that, well, graft and corruption is by definition dishonest. He argues not all of it is dishonest. There is a category known as honest graft and corruption. And he provides us with an example. He says, here's an example of honest corruption. So in the course of doing my job in City Hall, I find out that the city is going to buy up this plot of land so they can put in a park. So I go and I buy that plot of land and I buy it at a discount because no one except for me and a few other people in City Hall know what the plans of the city are. So I'm going to go out there and I'm going to buy this plot of land for a very low price. Then as soon as the city starts putting its plans together to purchase that land, then I will sell that land to the city for a handsome profit. That he considered to be honest corruption. He said, I seen my opportunities and I took them. So that's an example of a lack of fiscal accountability. Today, we would say he was using information that he got in the course of his public position for private gain. It's a similar type of corollary to the discussions going on in Congress now about stock trading and how we have members of Congress who go into Congress with maybe a net value of $50,000, and then after a couple of terms, they come out with a net value of $5 or $10 million because they have engaged in trading based upon ostensibly, allegedly, information that they have obtained through the course of their public duties. So I think we would all agree today that's dishonest, but back in the Tammany Hall days, that was considered to be something that was fair game. But that's an example of how most of our ethical issues tend to revolve around fiscal accountability, oftentimes taking public resources and using them for private gain. But a second type of accountability is what's known as process accountability. Process accountability is concerned with how public agencies are performing their tasks. So this essentially looks at how agencies are implementing the programs that they are charged with implementing. So are they implementing these programs in an efficient way in which they are not wasting public resources in doing their jobs? So process accountability looks primarily at program and policy implementation. Then program accountability looks at the outputs and the outcomes of these actions. So program accountability is concerned with whether a public program has achieved its purpose as that purpose is defined in law. So here we're looking at the effectiveness of the programs and the policies that we are implementing. So when we hold people accountable, we can hold them accountable, number one, through fiscal accountability in terms of how they're spending the money to make sure that they are spending the money in the legally appropriate ways and not benefiting their own private interests. We can hold people accountable in terms of their efficiency of implementation and managing of public money, or we can also hold them accountable in terms of how effective their actions are in benefiting the citizens and the beneficiaries who are intended to benefit from these public programs. So there are a lot of different ways in which we can hold people accountable for their actions. But in holding people accountable for their actions, we have to understand that accountability is a balance, as I had said before. It is a balance between having the correct set of external accountability controls, external ethical rules and standards, and the internal character and training of administrators to abide by those external standards. So, in order to hold people accountable effectively, what we need to do is balance the external controls, these ethical codes of conduct, and these rules and regulations with making sure we're hiring people who are truly invested in the public interest and are in that position for the right reason, that right reason being to serve the public, and that we also provide them with the training so that they know what actions they should and should not be doing from more of a normative type of perspective. So we need both the external as well as the internal. We also need to protect people. And so if we have administrators in an agency and those administrators see something that is unethical, either something that's unethical fiscally or whatever the case may be, that they have the confidence to report that. Because again, who knows best what's going on within the agency than the people who are actually working in that agency on a daily basis? Those are our whistleblowers. And so what we need to do is make sure that people are comfortable enough to stay within the organization even after reporting unethical behavior. Because once someone reports unethical behavior, they have two different choices. One choice is they can be the voice, which means they're the voice of ethics. They stay within that organization, even though they disagreed with some of the things the organization did and reported those activities. We want them to stay in the organization and be the voice of ethics. Their other choice is they can exit, they can leave the organization. If they leave the organization, we have now lost that whistleblower. And so we have now lost insight into what's going on within that organization. So we need to have very strong whistleblower protections in order to be able to achieve accountabilities. These are the people who take it upon themselves to disclose the activities that they believe to be wrong, that they believe to run afoul of regulations and laws. The federal level, we have whistleblower protections in place through the Whistleblower Protection Act. Here in the state of California, we have our own state-based Whistleblower Protection Act called the California Whistleblower Protection Act. I have links here on our slide for websites. One website will take you to a description of the Federal Whistleblower Protection Act. The other one takes you to the state of California state auditor site to show you some of the provisions under the State Whistleblower Act. I won't follow those links here, but those are links that you can follow on your own to kind of see some of the details. But just to give you some specifics about how the federal and the California Whistleblower Acts work. At the federal level, the Federal Whistleblowers Act, which was passed in, I believe it was in 1990, 1989, 1990, and that Federal Whistleblowers Act allows for whistleblowers, if they see something in their agency that they want to report, the misuse of money, misappropriation of money, malfeasance, misfeasance, they can report that instance to what's called the Office of Special Counsel, otherwise known as the OSC, the Office of Special Counsel. The Office of Special Counsel, when it was first created in 1978 under the Civil Service Reform Act, was created within another organization called the Merit System Protection Board. So the Office of Special Counsel originally was just a smaller part of this bigger organization called the Merit System Protection Board. However, in the Whistleblower Act, we realized that the Office of Special Counsel, because it was within this Merit System Protection Board, it lacked its own staffing, it lacked its own budget. It simply didn't have the resources necessary to follow up on all these whistleblower claims. And there was a huge backlog of whistleblower claims. So in the Whistleblower Protection Act, we pulled the Office of Special Counsel out of the Merit System Protection Board and made it its own independent agency. And I kind of put quotation marks around the word independent because we're not quite as sure as independent it is, how independent it is today as compared to what it was back in the Whistleblower Protection Act time. And I say that because the head of the Office of Special Counsel was fired by President Trump. And that former head of the Office of Special Counsel sued. And they took their case up and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. But it was declared moot at the Supreme Court level because the former head of the Office of Special Counsel dropped the case. And he dropped the case after it got through the Court of Appeals. So by the time it got to the Supreme Court, he had already dropped the case. And so it was declared moot. So we didn't really get an answer from the Supreme Court as to whether or not the president has the independent power to fire the head of this independent agency known as the Office of Special Counsel. It is concerning if the Office of Special Counsel is no longer independent, because this is where whistleblowers need to go. Not only was the head of the Office of Special Counsel fired, but a lot of the employees in the Office of Special Counsel also lost their jobs. In addition, we also had every federal agency and department had its own what was called Office of Inspector General. So a whistleblower could take their case directly to the Office of Special Counsel. Or if they trust their agency, they could go to the Office of Inspector General within their federal agency or department. Those offices of Inspector General in most federal agencies and departments have been done away with in the current administration. So currently, if you're a whistleblower, you don't have the Office of Inspector General within your agency to go to. If you go to the Office of Special Counsel, it's kind of unlikely that you're going to have your case heard because they just don't have the staff to be able to do it or the leadership anymore to be able to do it. Under the Whistleblower Protection Act, if you blow the whistle to the Office of Special Counsel and the Office of Special Counsel doesn't take any remediation action within 120 days, you can then take your case to the Merit System Protection Board. So your backup was the Merit System Protection Board. The current administration has gotten rid of commissioners from the Merit System Protection Board as well. And so the Merit System Protection Board also is understaffed, much like the Office of Special Counsel. So I think that there is some legitimate question about just how effectively the OSC and the Merit System Protection Board will be able to deal with their backlog of cases. But at least in theory, under the Whistleblower Protection Act, it's the Office of Special Counsel and the Merit System Protection Board that are the two agencies that are meant to deal with these whistleblower claims outside of the agency. Within the agency, it's the Office of Inspector General, which again no longer exists in most federal agencies. Here in the state of California, with our Whistleblower Protection Act, whistleblowers can take their case, their state employees, to the California State Auditor's Office. The California State Auditor's Office will review the whistleblower claim, but then they will not take remedial action. So any remediation of that claim will then be left to other agencies depending upon where the person works. And so, for example, if you're a state employee and you work for the Cal State system, then once the state auditor receives and reviews and investigates your claim, any remediation that would need to be done would then be done by the Cal State University system. And so it depends where you're working in the state government, where remediation would occur. But it is centralized, at least in terms of submitting your claim and investigation, that is centralized in the California State Auditor's Office. So we do have, at least in theory, these whistleblower protections. These whistleblower protections are vital because if you cannot protect your whistleblowers, obviously they're going to feel that they're going to be retaliated against, and they're probably going to leave the organization or just simply not report these unethical types of behaviors. So it's important we have those voices within our agencies. So I think we can all agree that in the public sector, we tend to have higher ethical standards and higher accountability standards that we are held to as compared to working in a private corporation. Whenever people leave the private sector and move into the public sector, those higher ethical standards and expectations and rules and regulations oftentimes will lead to a shock of ethical upgrade. And so when people move from the private sector into the public sector, they are shocked by all the regulations that they have to follow. I think Brendan made a good example, gave us a good example of that in terms of contracting. And now the law that we have that if you're going to contract, you have to give notice to the union. That is a limitation on how you go out there and contract work. Competitive bidding is a limitation in public contract code in terms of how you can bid out projects and how you go through a competitive bidding competitive bidding process. I've gone through a lot of those when I served in the school district, and I know we've had some very conflictual types of situations when we've gone out to bid, where we've had some contractors who have done a bid protest and that they have felt that the awarding of the bid was not done in alignment with competitive bidding processes. If you work in any type of contracting in your agency, you know just how specific California state law is in terms of public contract code. So you've got all these limitations that are placed upon you as a public administrator. Sometimes all of those limitations make it difficult for us to attract people from the private sector into the public sector. Coming into the public sector, they're probably going to have a lower salary. They're going to have a lot more hoops to jump through in terms of getting their position. Once employed, they're going to have all these rules and regulations and stipulations that they need to adhere to. So sometimes it is difficult. The more accountability mechanisms you have, the more difficult it is to attract the best and the brightest into the public service. And Brendan says, yeah, someone who went from private to public is a significant adjustment, especially in terms of procurement. And Marina, yeah, bid protests are certainly not fun at all. And I've lived through a few of those, and there have been a couple where I know my district has decided to go out there and rebid and open up the bidding process again. One of those bid protests was that whenever the bid comes in, and some of you who work in this field, you know this, whenever the bid comes in, the bidder that is awarded the contract must be considered to be both fiscally, financially responsible, as well as the bid being responsive. Responsible means that they have to be bonded, they have to be registered with the Department of Industrial regulations. They then also, their bid has to be responsive to the RFP, the request for proposals. I know in one of our bid protests, we had a protest from another contractor because one of the subcontractors in the awarded bid, that subcontractor had not listed their DIR number. It's a Department of Industrial Relations, I should say. Their Department of Industrial Relations number, they had not listed in that bid. And since it was not listed in that bid, technically that bid should not have been accepted. And so we had to go out and rebid the entire process. And that really takes a lot of time and a lot of additional effort. So we've got a lot of these limitations, a lot of these rules and regulations that we need to adhere to. So the question then becomes, if we have lower salaries, And if we have all these limitations of this ethical shock upgrade that people have to deal with coming from the private into the public sector, how do we still attract people to work in the public sector? And I would make an argument that we need to, from the top down, make public service more attractive to people. And I think that we have had some examples in the past of administrations at the very top of the federal bureaucracy that have really valued public service and made it very clear how much they value public service. President George H.W. Bush referred to government service as being, quote unquote, the highest and most noblest calling. President Obama, when he ran in 2008, said one of the goals of his campaign was to, quote unquote, make government and public service cool again. We know that public service is complicated, but we need to, from the top down, show people just what a fulfilling vocation public service can be because of the amount of impact and the benefits that you can have for the public. And we know that governments writ large touch just about every aspect of an individual's life. And so the potential to really make an impact on the lives of others is really very profound. And whenever I admit people into the DLMPA program, I read statements. When I was department chair and admitting people to the stateside program, I read their statements. And it always is encouraging for me to read those statements and see just how much people who are coming in the MPA program really do value public service and how they're here to make a difference. And I think I don't think I've ever read a statement from an applicant that did not in one way or another talk about serving the public interest and trying to make their society and make their community a better place to be. Not to take you back to the 1970s again, but there's a very famous public administration book from 1970 by Charles Goodsell. And Charles Goodsell wrote this book called The Case for the Bureaucracy. And this is essentially the argument that Charles Goodsell made. He said that people tend to have a very negative view of the bureaucracy because of a negative experience that they've had. So, according to Goodsell, people may have had 10 really good experiences with bureaucratic agencies, but then they have one negative experience. And that one negative experience then colors their entire perception of the entire bureaucracy. And so, according to Goodsell, what we need to do as public administrators and as public leaders is we need to show how essential the work of the bureaucracy really is to the quality of life of people on a daily basis. And I think Goodsell was right in 1970. And I think he is just as correct today. And that will then allow us to continue to attract the best and the brightest into public service. So when we come into the public service and we become public administrators, we come into the public service just like we come into this MPA program from a variety of different backgrounds. Public administrators are engineers. Public administrators are budget managers and finance managers. They're HR managers. They're project managers. They're procurement managers. They come from a variety of different backgrounds in a variety of different professions. Since public administrators come from a variety of different professions, each one of those professions will have its own code of conduct. And in this distance learning program, years ago, we had a work site type of focus. And so we would offer this program at different work sites, virtually, but at different work sites. And one of our work sites was OCTA. And OCTA, most of the people out of OCTA were coming as engineers. And so they were professional engineers and they adhered to their engineering code of conduct. When we become public administrators, there is one code of conduct that is common to all public administrators, and that comes to us from the American Society for Public Administration, otherwise known as ASPA. And that is this ASPA code of conduct made up of 8 different ethical principles. The first principle in the ASPA code of conduct is public interest. That we as public administrators are required to promote the interests of the public and put service to the public above service to oneself. This is something that Tammany Hall and George Washington Plunkett should have been aware of when they were in office, but we always serve the public interest and put public interest above private interest. Number two, to uphold the Constitution and the law. Respect and support government constitutions and laws while seeking to improve laws and policies to promote the public good. This is why in our class session last week, we took time to go through the Constitution, even in a little bit of a cursory manner. We went through the Constitution because it's important that we uphold the Constitution, not just because of this code of conduct, but also, as we talked about last week, because of qualified good faith immunity. Number three, promote democratic participation. Inform the public and encourage active engagement in governance. Be open, transparent, and responsive, and respect and assist all persons in their dealings with public organizations. Again, there's a little bit of a moral hazard here in that the more you open up the operations of your organization to public scrutiny, the more public scrutiny you're going to get. And so that's when you're going to start getting those emails. That's when you're going to start getting people attending city council meetings and school board meetings and using the public comment period sometimes to shred you publicly. That's something that you have to get used to whenever you are serving on one of those boards. But it's something that is important for us from our ASPA Code of Conduct, that we need to promote the participation of the public in the work of government. Number four, strengthen social equity. Treat all persons with fairness, justice, and equality, and respect individual differences, rights, and freedoms. Promote affirmative action and other initiatives to reduce unfairness, injustice, and inequality in society. This idea of strengthening social equity really does harken back to the new public administration approach, where social equity and social justice are two important values within the new approach to studying public administration. Number five, fully inform and advise, and I had mentioned this one before. Provide accurate, honest, comprehensive, and timely information and advice to elected and appointed officials and governing board members and to staff members in your organization. Even though we have that moral hazard, that disincentive to do so, we need to fully inform and advise, especially those who have oversight responsibilities over us as administrators. Number six, demonstrate personal integrity. Adhere to the highest standards of conduct to inspire public confidence and trust in public service. This is what Martin and Bennington would refer to as an expository role. The public leaders and managers need to take an expository role. An expository role means that they are role models, that they are modeling ethics and they're modeling integrity for the public. Number seven, promote ethical organizations. Strive to attain the highest standards of ethics, stewardship, and public service in organizations that serve the public. So not only do we need to be ethical as individuals, but we need to promote ethical organizations. So we really need to try and feed into that culture of that organization and our norms and expectations for behaviors to make sure that we are expecting ethical behavior on the part of everyone within our organization. And then number eight, to advance professional excellence. Strengthen personal capabilities to act competently and ethically, and encourage the professional development of others. This is one we sometimes overlook in terms of our code of conduct, to encourage the professional development of others. We have been talking for, it seems like decades, about the tsunami, the retirement tsunami that is coming in government. We start to witness that tsunami a bit with the advent of COVID-19. And with the return to work requirements after COVID-19, we've seen a lot of people decide they're not returning to work. And so we've kind of seen a lot of people leave the public service. At the federal level, through the first year of the Trump administration, we have seen 234,000 federal employees leave the public service, not necessarily by choice, but sometimes forced to leave. That's a huge downsizing of the federal bureaucracy. Not quite to the size that we saw in the Clinton Gore administration, where over 300,000 federal employees left their jobs, but 234,000 in 1 year is a pretty large downsizing of the federal bureaucracy. As people leave, either by choice through retirement or to go to the private sector, or whatever the case may be, we certainly lose a lot of institutional memory. So it's important for us to engage in succession planning. And hopefully your organization is involved in succession planning. Sometimes I teach a class in organizational effectiveness. And whenever I teach that class, one of the projects that students do is identify a problem in their organization, and then they put together reasonable solutions for that problem to address that problem, and then select one of those solutions and justify why it's the most appropriate. Without fail, and every time I would teach that class, I would have at least probably 20 to 30% of the class would pick a lack of succession planning as the primary problem in their organization. So by encouraging the professional development of others, we are hopefully putting together a succession plan so that we have younger employees who are then imbued with those skills to then be able to move up and fill those positions once those more senior employees leave the bureaucracy. We've also seen every year the federal government, except for this year, they stopped doing it this year, but every year up through 2024, the federal government, primarily the Office of Personnel Management, has gone out there and done a study of federal employees to see how motivated and how engaged federal employees are. And as part of their demographic part of that study, they show the breakdown by generation of members of the federal bureaucracy. And every year we see the baby boomer population decreasing. We see the Gen X population decreasing, and we start to see an increase in millennials, and now we're starting to see the advent of Gen Z in the federal workforce as well. The generation that's still a plurality is Gen X, but probably not for much longer. I'd say probably within another 5 to 10 years, they will no longer be the plurality in the federal bureaucracy. So we need to promote this professional development of younger employees so that they can fill those shoes. So those are the 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Conduct that we as public administrators all share. So you'll be using this ASPA Code of Conduct for your Canvas essay number 2. And what I'm asking you to do in Canvas essay number 2 is to select 3 of those 8 principles that you believe would be difficult either for you individually to implement or difficult for your organization to implement. And then tell me why you think those are the 3 of the 8 that are the most difficult to implement. Here in California, we also know that we place very much of a premium on transparency. We are, though we're the Golden State, we are a sunshine state, and that we have a lot of these transparency regulations and laws to let the sun shine in so that the public can not only see but can also participate in the decision making of governments. Here in California, we have things like the Brown Act that require public meetings. And so if you're going to have a majority of a city council or majority of a school board or a board of supervisors, that it has to be a public meeting. So that meeting has to be sunshine. You also have limitations in the Brown Act in terms of the types of topics that can be discussed in these open meetings. Those topics must be listed in an agenda. That agenda must be published publicly at least 72 hours in advance. Members of that governing body, members of that city council are then restricted to discussing the issues, the items that are on the agenda. You're not allowed to discuss non-agendized items. If you want to discuss a non-agendized item, you would have to ask to have a place on the agenda of a future meeting. Again, what we want to do here is we want to make sure that people know what is being discussed. So if they want to come and make a public comment, they can do that. We have to have a public comment period in these meetings as well. Now, the Brown Act does allow for city councils and governing boards to place reasonable limitations on the amount of time for public comment. A lot of organizations will place a 2 or 3 minute limit on each public comment, and then will place an overall limit on the comments for an agenda item. So you might say, 2 minutes for each individual public comment and a grand total of 30 minutes for comments on this agenda item. But then you also have to allow members of the public to comment on non-agendized items as well. So what most organizations will do is they'll have one set of comments for agendized items and another set of comments then for non-agendized items. Members of the board, members of the city council are not allowed to respond to public comments on non-agendized items. And that leads to a lot of consternation on the part of members of the public because members of the city council have said, we can't comment on that because that's not part of our published agenda. You are allowed to have closed session, and so you can have closed session outside of the purview of members of the public, but the Brown Act really limits the types of issues that can be covered in closed session. And if you deal with city councils or school boards, you know what some of those issues are. You can certainly, if you have personnel issues, dismissal types of issues, evaluation types of issues, those types of things can be done in closed session because of privacy. If you have conversations with your legal counsel over pending litigation or anticipated litigation, that can also be done in closed session. So there are if you have some type of a claim that's filed against your government and you're coming to a settlement on that claim, that can also then be done in closed session. But usually whenever you take votes in closed session, those votes do need to then be reported out in open session. You cannot start your meeting in closed session. You have to start in open session and then recess into closed session. You cannot start in closed session. Members of the public can also make comments for closed session items as well. That's all part of this Brown Act. It really does also limit the way in which members of a governing body can communicate with each other. So if you have two members of the governing body communicating with each other, that's okay. However, if that second member then communicates to a third member who communicates to a fourth member, that's considered to be a serial meeting or what's called a daisy chain, and that would then be a violation of the Brown Act. Transparency in California also allows for a public record requests. And so we have a California Public Records Act. And so if you want to get documentation, whether it be emails or contracts that have been awarded by the city, you can put in a public records request. The government then has 10 days, a maximum of 10 days to respond to your public records requests. You are not required to fill out a form. Some governments still provide a public records request form for people to fill out. You don't have to do that. The Supreme Court in California has decided that an email will suffice for a public records request. So the government has 10 days to respond. It doesn't mean the government has 10 days to produce all discoverable files. That may take a while, but at least you have 10 days to respond and say, we anticipate having all the documents that are responsive to this request within 45 days or within 60 days. So you do have that flexibility. I don't know about your governments, but I know a lot of local governments are putting a lot of time and a lot of person hours into responding to these public records requests, especially in the wake of COVID. We've also created certain positions that are considered to be reportable positions. Reportable positions in the state of California are required to fill out conflict of interest forms, for example, at Form 700. In that conflict of interest form, you have to disclose any potential conflicts of interest that you may have. So, for instance, in your Form 700, you would have to disclose any property that you own within the jurisdiction that is not your primary residence. So if it's your primary residence, you do not have to disclose it. However, if you have rental properties located in the jurisdiction, you would have to disclose those rental properties, their location, and the value of those properties, because again, that could be a conflict of interest. If you are employed by any employers within the jurisdiction or any employers that have any business with the city, those employment relationships would also have to then be disclosed on your conflict of interest form. Again, what we're trying to do here is alert the public to any potential conflicts of interest so that the public can hold people accountable to then recuse themselves from discussions and decisions on anything that they may have a conflict of interest with. To kind of wrap up this discussion of accountability and ethics, accountability in the public sector, as we've said, really does require the striking of a balance. We need to balance external rules with the internal training and character of public administrators. We need administrators to be ethical. We need administrators to really buy into the idea of working for the benefit of the public. But at the same time, we need to balance that with freeing up our administrators to be willing to take risks and make good decisions, that they're willing to be innovative and creative without worrying about running afoul of violating some arcane ethical rule or guideline. So it's important for us in accountability to balance ethical adherence with administrative effectiveness, because if we cannot find that proper balance, we will not be able to meet the demands of our public. So that's kind of an introduction to accountability and ethics in the public sector. This is just an introduction. As we go through some of the subsequent topics in this class, we will, by definition, return to ethics. So we talk about differences between public and private sectors. We'll return to ethics. When we talk about the study of public administration, we'll return to Woodrow Wilson and the politics administration dichotomy and why that dichotomy is no longer valid. When we talk about managing fiscal resources, we'll return to ethics, managing human resources, and so on and so on. So this is just an introduction that we are going to return to with every topic that we cover throughout the remainder of this class. And you will then also cover ethics within the context of each of the core courses that you'll be taking here in the DL-MPA program. So based upon that relatively brief, it may seem long to you, but relatively brief introduction to accountability and ethics in the public sector, any questions, any observations, any comments on any of this material? Then what I'd like to do, instead of doing a second set of breakout rooms, what I'd like to do is just very briefly kind of talk to you a little bit about doing research in public administration. Because again, like I said, I provided for you on our Canvas site that video by Kelly Janicek, whereby she came in and did a presentation on how to conduct public administration research. I think it's helpful for us to provide that video here in this class rather than have her come in and do yet another presentation. But if you watch that video, she will take you through some of the granular elements of how you use electronic databases and use library databases in order to do public administration related research. I've also provided for you, if you haven't done any research yet in the Cal State Long Beach Library, I also have a Word document that I've included in our module for this week, kind of a getting started document for how you can get started searching for public administration related types of literature. Again, Kelly does a much more thorough job of that. That is just what I provide for you in that Word document. It's just kind of a quick and dirty way to get started with doing research using the university library. So let me share with you something that let's talk a bit about. Got to remember where I have it. Here we go. A bit about using public administration journals, because the research that you'll be doing in future courses in this program will be research that comes from peer-reviewed journals. Now, we don't use a lot of books in future courses because, books can be very outdated and they go through a different peer review process. The gold standard in public administration research, as it is in a lot of social science research, is using articles from peer-reviewed journals. So let's talk a bit about what a peer-reviewed journal is, and then I'll have a list here for you of some of the highest ranked journals in public administration. So, as you may know from your undergraduate research experiences, peer-reviewed journals are journals that where the manuscripts, when they're submitted to the journal, they go through a blind refereed process. And typically it's a double-blind refereed process. What that means is when a manuscript gets submitted to a journal, the manuscript will initially go to an editor. The editor will look at that article, that manuscript, to make sure that it fits the mission and the scope of the journal. If it matches the mission and the scope of the journal, the editor will make an initial decision whether or not to then send that manuscript to a board of reviewers. Typically, most good double-blind refereed journals will have a reviewer board of maybe 3 to 5 for each manuscript. So let's say you have 3 reviewers for that manuscript. The manuscript will then be sent to those reviewers. When those reviewers receive that manuscript, the manuscript will have no identifiers on it. So the reviewers will have no idea of the identity of the author of the manuscript. They'll also have no idea of the institutional affiliation of the author of that manuscript. That's what gives you kind of that blind process. The author of that manuscript also does not know who the reviewers are, and that's what makes it double blind. So the author doesn't know who the reviewers are, the reviewers do not know who the author is. Those reviewers will then review that manuscript, and oftentimes they are provided with a rubric by the editor of the journal. They'll use that rubric to then review the manuscript. They'll review the manuscript on a variety of different criteria. They'll again look at the manuscript to see if the topic is in alignment with the journal. They'll also look at the problem statement. So, what type of problem is being addressed in this manuscript? Is it an important problem? Is it a problem that's aligned with public administration? They'll look at the literature review that the author conducted in doing their manuscript. They will look at the research question that's being asked in the manuscript. They will look at the research design that's being used. They will look at the sampling design that's being used. They will look at the variables and how their operational definitions are being constructed. And so they'll go through all these different elements of the manuscript, and they will then offer recommendations. Those recommendations will then be sent to the editor. So those recommendations will be specific recommendations in terms of maybe the author may want to consider using a stratified random sample as opposed to a simple random sample or something like that. So it will be that specific. But then they'll also make a recommendation to the editor about whether or not this article should be published. And typically there are 3 recommendations that they can make. The first recommendation is to accept the article as is without revisions. That's not going to happen. In any good journal, any rigorous review journal, it's not going to happen. In my entire 30-year career writing research articles, I've had that happen to me one time, where I've had an article that was actually accepted without any types of revisions. So that just simply usually does not happen. The second decision they can make is the much more common one, and that's what's called an R&R, otherwise known as a revise and resubmit. So the article gets a revise and resubmit decision. The editor will then send it back to the author and will say, the reviewers have recommended revise and resubmit, and here are all their recommendations. It is then up to the author to decide whether or not they want to make those recommendations. If they decide to make those revisions, those recommended changes, they will make those revisions. Then they will submit the revised manuscript back into the editor, who will then send it back to those same reviewers to then review it and see whether or not those revisions are sufficient to then warrant publication in the journal. The third decision that the reviewers can make is denial. So if they look at it and they think that it's fundamentally and fatally flawed in terms of being a topic or the methodology, and these are not fixable issues, they will recommend to the editor to deny publication. But for the most part, you'll usually get a revise and resubmit in most good journals. Now, authors don't need to revise and resubmit. If they don't like the recommendations, they can pull their manuscript and say, never mind, I don't want to publish it here, and take it to another journal. But authors can only submit a manuscript to one journal at a time. And whenever you submit your manuscript, there'll be a disclaimer that you'll have to sign saying this manuscript is only under consideration with this journal, because they don't want you sending it out to a bunch of different journals and then picking which one you want to publish in. So that's what's called a double blind refereed reviewed process. So we are going to want to use articles out of those types of journals, which then raises the question, well, when I'm doing my research, how do I know that a journal is a refereed peer-reviewed journal? There are a couple ways that you can do that. One way is through the database itself. And so a lot of the electronic databases, you can tell the database, search only for peer-reviewed journal articles. You just click that box on the left-hand side, and then the database will only show you articles from those peer-reviewed journals. Now, that will only show you articles from peer-reviewed journals that the database algorithm considers to be peer-reviewed. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are high-quality journals. The second way in which you can do it is you can go directly to the journal's publication site and go directly to the publisher of the journal, to their website, and look at their manuscript submission guidelines. The manuscript submission guidelines will tell potential authors exactly what the review process looks like. And again, you're looking for a double-blind refereed process where you have reviewers, more than one reviewer, usually 3 to 5 reviewers who are experts in the field. They will probably also tell you the percentage of manuscripts that eventually get published in their journal. If you're seeing 100% of manuscripts get published in the journal, obviously it's not a very rigorous process. Some of the more rigorous journals will publish somewhere around 5 or 6 or 10% of the manuscripts that get submitted. That's how you know that it's a very rigorous review process. Another way is to look at the journal's impact factor. And so there's this thing known as a journal impact factor. And the impact factor is a measure of the number of times on average that an article in the journal has been cited by other articles, other authors of other articles. So the way in which the impact factor will be calculated is that they will look at perhaps the last 3 years of articles published in that journal. And they'll look at all the articles that have been published in the last 3 years. And then they'll look at the number of times that those articles have been cited by the authors of articles that have been published elsewhere. And so you'll see, like, you can, Google it and look up for an article. It'll tell you how many times it's been cited. And so you take that impact factor will be the average number of times that an article that was published in the last 3 years in the journal has been cited. So it's the average number of times that the article has been cited by others. So these impact factors here in the world of public administration tend to be relatively low. So for instance, what I have on the screen, hopefully you can see it, is a website that lists the public administration journals with the highest impact factors. So here, the number one journal by impact factor is what's known as JPART. It's the Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory. In 2024, it had an impact factor of 6.3. That means that the average number of times an article was cited in the last 3 years was 6.3. So that's the average for all the articles that were published over that 3-year period of time. So an article was cited an average of 6.3 times. Policy and society, and you'll go down the list. Public administration review is listed here on this list as number 5 with an impact factor of a 4.9. Public administration review, PAR, is typically seen as kind of being the granddaddy of them all in public administration. So if you're publishing articles in public administration review, that is a very rigorous review process. You can see, so I'll let you read through the other ones on this list on your own, but that just kind of lists out for you the impact factors for some of the journals in public administration. Now, if you want to use an article from a journal that is not on this list, that's absolutely fine. This is not a comprehensive list. For example, I've done work in the past in the area of federalism, and I've published articles in Publius, the Journal of Federalism. Publius is the number one journal in the field of federalism, but it's a very niche field. And so public administration is big as a field. Federalism is a much smaller subset of that. And so by definition, the impact factor is going to be smaller for those more niche types of journals. Example from this list would be the Review of Public Personnel Administration, an excellent journal, but it only has an impact factor of 3.1 because, again, it only focuses on public personnel management. So this list is just kind of illustrative, but it is not exclusive. And so The impact factor is just there to kind of give you an idea of how rigorous the publication standards are for a public administration journal. Now, if you're going to look at impact factors in other fields, such as the natural sciences, they're going to have impact factors of 40, 30, 35. They're going to have huge impact factors because they do a lot more citations in the natural sciences and a lot more publishing than we do here in the social sciences, especially in a field like public administration. So any impact factor that's above about a 2 or 2.5, that's a pretty rigorous type of review process. So it means that people have eyes on that journal and people are using those articles for their own research. So anywhere in the twos or above is a pretty rigorous type of journal in public administration. So just kind of keep that in mind as you are doing research in future courses, that your research typically should be coming from these peer-reviewed journals, and hopefully you'll be using research from rigorous, well thought of and well received public administration journals. In my mind, PAR is still kind of the top of the heap when it comes to the most prestigious journals in public administration. There are other organizations. This is just one organization. This is the Observatory of International Research. This is just one example. A lot of organizations do their own impact factor ratings. And so you can just Google public administration journals impact factors, and you'll get a whole list of different types of organizations that will produce impact factors. And they may be slightly different from the one I'm showing you here. But again, just make sure you're using articles from peer-reviewed journals. But if you could, please do watch that presentation by Kelly Janicek that I have up on our Canvas site, and that should help prepare you if you haven't done any research in public administration or haven't done any research using our library here at Cal State Long Beach. She introduces you to some of the major databases, PAIS, JSTOR, and some of the others that are especially useful for public administration research. I know it's not quite 8:30, but I thought we'd probably wrap it up here because again, you have that hour-long video that I'd like for you to watch. I don't want to add more time on since I know you're going to be spending an hour watching that video. What we've covered up to this point in time, plus that hour you watch the video, pretty much takes up our full 3.5 hours for the class. Do you have any questions about any of the information we've covered tonight in terms of accountability and ethics, or anything I've been babbling on to you about in terms of using peer-reviewed journals and the importance of impact factors? Any questions at all or any observations?
I suppose, can I ask if, when it comes to publication, does it matter what year it's from, or rather, like if we're doing a specific topic, is it important to keep it up to date?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know there are some instructors who will ask that any research you use must be in the last 5 years or in the last 10 years. So usually you're looking for that type of contemporary research. The exception to that, though, would be there are some articles that are really classic articles that are okay to refer to. So if you're talking about, for example, differences between public and private organizations. Graham Allison is kind of the keystone argument for that. And that's an article that was published in the 1980s. And so that you can still use some of those older ones, but you do want to try and stay as contemporary as you can because the field is changing and the research certainly is changing. And the primary change in public administration research has been in terms of increased sophistication, in terms of statistical analysis. We become much more statistically oriented. We become much more quantitative in the past 10 to 20 years than we were before. Marina, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
I was just wondering if there are any upcoming assignments in which we will be required to conduct this kind of research, or if this is just for future reference in future courses.
Great question. This is for future reference for future courses. Yeah, there's nothing in this course where you'll have to do that. We're just an introductory course. Organization theory, you will be doing some research for your organizational analysis paper once you take that class with me. And so you'll be using this type of research, these research skills to do that, but it'll be in your future courses. I see Monica asked a question. Is the website we're looking at the most preferred place to look for articles? This website, again, is just one listing of some of the more prestigious articles in public administration according to their impact factor. And so it's not a comprehensive list. What I would say is the best way to approach this is when you're doing research in future courses, it's going to depend upon the topic that you are researching. So if you're researching a topic, it may not just be in public administration. So if you're researching a topic that deals with, public finance, that could cross over into finance journals, could cross over into business journals. So I would say orient your research around your topic itself. And then once you orient around your topic yourself and you start to get those hits in terms of the articles, that's when you can be a little bit more discerning instead of, well, is this truly in alignment with public administration or not? But your research topic is what really should guide your research process. And again, you've probably done this before. You've done Boolean searches. You're probably familiar with Boolean searches, using words like "and" in order to change your search results, using words like "or." Whenever you use "and" you say something such as tax and expenditure and limitation. So if you want to do research on tax expenditure limitations, you would say tax and expenditure and limitation. The results you would get will only be results that have all three of those words, tax, expenditure, limitation, in them. So it really is a good way to narrow down your research. If you want to broaden your research, you could use a word like "or." So if you say tax or expenditure or limitation, then you're going to get articles that have either the word tax or the word expenditure or the word limitation. So it would be a much broader type of search. The Boolean searches I like to use are the ands because that really does narrow it down. And you can save yourself a lot of time because you'll get just the articles that focus on the topic that you are interested in. Absolutely. I'm very, very happy to do it. And yeah, if you haven't done research in a while, that presentation by Kelly Janicek is very useful. And it's also very useful because she focuses only on public administration. So she only focuses on the databases and the sources that are useful for our discipline. And so it really does narrow it down very nicely for you. And again, Kelly has been doing this for many, many years. She's been here as long as I have, I think. And she's been our public administration disciplinary librarian, I think, pretty much the whole time she's been here. So she is very much an expert on those databases in public administration. So I think that video will probably be useful for you. There may be some questions that she's answering from people in the class at that time. So I hope that's not distracting, but I think she does a really nice job with her presentation. Okay, if there's nothing else, we'll call it quits here for tonight. Do remember your Canvas essay number 2 is due by next Wednesday. Just do the same job you did on Canvas essay number 1 on Canvas essay number 2, and we will be in very good shape because I was very impressed with all the answers to Canvas essay number 1. Okay. Any questions you have, feel free to shoot me an email. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy the rest of your week, and I will see you back again for week number 3 next Wednesday. So take care, everyone. Have a great
Thank
week.
you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.